80 years ago, during the hellish Battle of Okinawa in 1945, Sergeant Michael "Torch" Henderson and his four-man crew disappeared without leaving traces. Their absence plunged families into tragedy and silent grief, while the community and fellow soldiers remained confused by the mystery. Military archives suggested hypotheses, but no conclusion was reached. The case fell into official oblivion, but the families never lost hope, fighting for the truth to emerge. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell. Here we reopen archived cases with respect and proof. The morning of June 18, 1945, dawned gray and humid over the southern ridges of Okinawa. The 713th Tank Battalion had been grinding through Japanese defensive positions for weeks, their M4A3R3 Zippo flamethrower tanks becoming instruments of both salvation and horror in the Pacific Theater. Sergeant Michael Henderson, a 23-year-old from rural Nebraska, had earned the nickname Torch for his precision with the flamethrower's devastating stream. Henderson's crew consisted of 4 men who had become brothers through months of combat. Private First Class Danny Kowalski from Detroit operated the bow machine gun, his steady hands and sharp eyes making him invaluable in close-quarters fighting. Corporal James "Jimmy" Rodriguez from San Antonio served as the loader and assistant gunner, his mechanical skills keeping their temperamental equipment functioning under impossible conditions. Private Eddie Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco, handled radio communications with remarkable calm even under the most intense fire. Finally, Private Tommy O'Brien from Boston served as the driver. His ability to navigate treacherous terrain and his steady nerves under pressure had saved their lives countless times. The tank they called Nebraska's Revenge had become legendary among the battalion. Henderson had painted a small cornfield scene on the turret, a reminder of home that seemed almost surreal amid the volcanic rock and coral caves of Okinawa. The M4A3R3 was a fearsome machine, mounting a Canadian-designed flamethrower system capable of projecting napalm over 100 yards. Its psychological effect on Japanese defenders was as devastating as its physical destruction. That morning, intelligence reported unusual enemy movement in the Kunigami sector, where Japanese forces appeared to be massing for another desperate Banzai charge. These suicidal attacks had become increasingly frequent as the Imperial forces faced inevitable defeat. Henderson's crew received orders to advance to forward positions and provide flamethrower support if the anticipated attack materialized. The last confirmed radio transmission from Nebraska's Revenge came at 0847 hours. Private Chen's voice crackled through the static. "Command, this is Zippo 7. Enemy movement confirmed. Large concentration of infantry advancing through the caves. Request permission to engage." The response came immediately. "Zippo 7, you are cleared to engage." Burn them out. What happened next would remain a mystery for 8 decades. At approximately 0900 hours, other units in the sector reported hearing the distinctive roar of Henderson's flamethrower, followed by small arms fire and what witnesses described as an explosion that shook the ground. When the smoke cleared and forward elements advanced to investigate, they found nothing. No tank, no crew, no wreckage. It was as if Nebraska's Revenge and her 5-man crew had simply vanished into the volcanic soil of Okinawa. The initial search efforts were hampered by continuing Japanese resistance and the treacherous terrain. The area where Henderson's tank had last been seen was honeycombed with natural caves and man-made tunnels, many of which had been sealed or collapsed during the fighting. Battalion commanders assumed the tank had fallen into a concealed cave system, but repeated searches over the following days revealed nothing. As news of the disappearance filtered back to the families in the United States, 5 American households were plunged into a nightmare of uncertainty. Henderson's young wife, Mary, had just given birth to their son, Michael Jr., in Omaha. She waited by the mailbox every day for news that never came. The Kowalski family in Detroit held vigil at St. Stanislaus Church, lighting candles and praying for Danny's safe return. In San Antonio, the Rodriguez family gathered each evening to recite the rosary for Jimmy's soul. The Chen family in San Francisco faced additional hardships, as anti-Asian sentiment made their grief even more isolating. And in Boston, the O'Brien family's Irish wake seemed to stretch endlessly, as they mourned a son who might still be alive. The crew of Nebraska's Revenge had been forged in the crucible of Pacific combat, their bond strengthening through shared terror and triumph. Michael Henderson had grown up on a wheat farm outside Omaha, where the endless Nebraska sky had taught him patience and the value of hard work. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, he was 21 years old and engaged to Mary Sullivan, the daughter of the local banker. They married in a small ceremony just before he shipped out, knowing their honeymoon would have to wait until the war ended. Henderson's natural leadership qualities and mechanical aptitude quickly caught the attention of his superiors during training at Fort Knox. The M4A3R3 flamethrower tank was a complex machine requiring not just courage, but technical skill. The Canadian Ronson flamethrower system was notoriously temperamental, prone to jamming and backfire. Henderson spent countless hours studying the manuals and practicing with the equipment, understanding that his crew's survival depended on mastering every component. Danny Kowalski had grown up in Detroit's Polish neighborhood, where his father worked the assembly line at Ford. The sounds of industry were as familiar to him as his mother's pierced and prayer. When the draft notice arrived, Danny was working alongside his father, building the very tanks he would later fight in. His mechanical knowledge and steady nerves made him perfect for the bow gunner position, where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. The friendship between Henderson and Kowalski developed during their early training exercises. Both came from working-class backgrounds and shared a dry sense of humor that helped them cope with the stress of preparation for combat. They would often be found in the motor pool after hours, Henderson teaching Kowalski the intricacies of the flamethrower system, while Danny shared his knowledge of automotive mechanics. Jimmy Rodriguez brought a different energy to the crew. The son of Mexican immigrants in San Antonio, he had grown up bilingual and bicultural, navigating between his family's traditions and American society. His quick wit and infectious optimism became crucial for crew morale during the darkest moments of combat. Rodriguez had an almost supernatural ability to keep their equipment functioning under impossible conditions, jury-rigging repairs with salvaged parts and creative engineering. Eddie Chen faced unique challenges as one of the few Chinese-American soldiers in their unit. Born in San Francisco's Chinatown, he had grown up translating for his parents and navigating the complexities of being American-born to immigrant parents. His language skills and cultural understanding proved invaluable when dealing with local populations in the Pacific Theater. Chen's calm demeanor under fire and his ability to maintain radio communications during the most intense combat made him indispensable to the crew's survival. Tommy O'Brien, the youngest member of the crew at 19, brought enthusiasm and fearlessness that both inspired and worried his older teammates. Growing up in South Boston, he had learned to drive by stealing cars for joyrides, skills that translated surprisingly well to tank operation. His ability to navigate treacherous terrain and maintain speed under fire had saved their lives on numerous occasions. The five men had first seen combat together during the invasion of Saipan in June 1944. Their baptism by fire came during the desperate fighting around Mount Tapachau, where Japanese defenders had fortified caves and tunnels throughout the volcanic landscape. Henderson's precise use of the flamethrower proved devastatingly effective against these positions, but the psychological toll on the crew was immense. The horror of flamethrower warfare was something none of them had been prepared for during training. The screams of burning enemy soldiers haunted their dreams, and the acrid smoke and smell of charred flesh lingered in their nostrils long after battles ended. Henderson struggled with the moral weight of wielding such a terrible weapon, writing long letters to Mary about his doubts and fears. The crew developed rituals and coping mechanisms, relying on each other's strength when individual resolve faltered. By the time they reached Okinawa in April 1945, Nebraska's Revenge and her crew had become legendary within the 713th Tank Battalion. They had survived Saipan, Tinian, and Iwo Jima, each battle leaving its mark on both the machine and the men who operated it. The tank bore scars from enemy fire, hastily welded patches, and the accumulated grime of months in combat, but it remained operational, a testament to the crew's skill and dedication. Their reputation for effectiveness came with a price. Henderson's crew was often assigned to the most dangerous missions, tasked with clearing out the most heavily fortified positions. They had developed techniques for dealing with cave complexes, using the flamethrower's reach to flush out defenders while coordinating with infantry to secure cleared areas. Their success rate was unmatched, but each mission brought them closer to the statistical inevitability of combat casualties. The night before their final mission, the crew gathered in their foxhole for what had become their traditional pre-battle ritual. They would share stories from home, read excerpts from letters, and Henderson would lead them in a simple prayer his grandmother had taught him. Rodriguez would usually lighten the mood with jokes, while Chen would share news from the Pacific Theater gleaned from his radio monitoring. O'Brien would regale them with increasingly embellished tales of his adventures in Boston, and Kowalski would contribute practical observations about the mechanical condition of their equipment. None of them suspected that this familiar ritual would be their last time together as a complete crew. The immediate aftermath of the crew's disappearance sent shockwaves through the 713th Tank Battalion and eventually reached 5 American families who would spend the next 8 decades living with uncertainty. The official military investigation lasted only 2 weeks, hampered by ongoing combat operations and the chaotic nature of the Okinawa battlefield. With no wreckage, no bodies, and no witnesses to the actual moment of disappearance, the case was classified as missing in action, presumed dead, and filed away in the growing mountain of wartime casualties. For Mary Henderson, the telegram arrived on a humid Nebraska afternoon while she was feeding 6-month-old Michael Jr. The Western Union messenger, an elderly man who had delivered too many such messages during the war, could barely meet her eyes as he handed over the yellow envelope. The terse military language, "We regret to inform you that your husband, Sergeant Michael Henderson, has been reported missing in action during operations against the enemy in the Ryukyu Islands," felt inadequate to describe the collapse of her world. Mary's initial response was denial followed by desperate hope. She wrote letters to the War Department demanding more information, contacted her congressional representative, and even attempted to reach other tank crews who had served alongside her husband. The responses were always the same, official expressions of sympathy, followed by explanations that ongoing combat operations made further investigation impossible. The military suggested she should prepare for the worst while maintaining hope for the best, a phrase that would echo in her mind for decades. The Kowalski family in Detroit faced their tragedy differently. Danny's father, Stefan, had survived the trenches of World War I and understood the finality that war could bring. But Danny's mother, Anna, refused to accept her son's death without proof. She converted the front parlor of their house into a shrine, displaying Danny's high school photographs, his letters home, and a small Polish flag. Every morning, she would light a candle and pray in Polish, asking the Virgin Mary to protect her son wherever he might be. The ritual continued for over 40 years, until Anna's death in 1987. In San Antonio, the Rodriguez family's response reflected their deep Catholic faith and Mexican cultural traditions. Jimmy's parents, Miguel and Rosa, organized a novena that lasted 9 days, with family and friends gathering each evening to pray for Jimmy's soul. However, without a body to bury, they could not hold a proper funeral mass. This left a spiritual wound in the family that never fully healed. Rosa wore black for the rest of her life, and Miguel never spoke his son's name aloud again, believing that to do so would prevent Jimmy's spirit from finding peace. The Chen family's experience was complicated by the additional burden of racism and cultural misunderstanding. Eddie's parents, Chen Wei-ming and Li Mei, had immigrated from Guangdong province in the 1920s and still faced discrimination despite their son's service to America. When Eddie disappeared, some neighbors in San Francisco's Chinatown whispered that he had perhaps defected to the Japanese side, rumors that caused the family immense pain. Eddie's younger sister, Susan, who was attending the University of California, dedicated her life to proving her brother's loyalty and sacrifice, eventually becoming a military historian specializing in Asian American service members. Tommy O'Brien's disappearance devastated his large Irish Catholic family in South Boston. His mother, Bridget, had already lost 2 sons to the war, one at Normandy and another in the Philippines. Tommy's loss pushed her into a deep depression from which she never fully recovered. His father, Patrick, a dock worker, began drinking heavily and died of liver disease in 1952. The family's grief was compounded by Tommy's youth. At 19, he had seemed invincible, the baby of the family who was supposed to survive the war and carry on the O'Brien name. The military family's support system in post-war America was rudimentary compared to modern standards. There were no specialized counseling services for families of missing servicemen, no support groups, and no systematic follow-up on unresolved cases. The families were essentially left to cope with their trauma in isolation. Some, like Mary Henderson, eventually remarried and tried to build new lives. Others, like Anna Kowalski, became frozen in time, unable to move forward without closure. The decades that followed brought periodic false hopes. In 1953, during prisoner exchanges following the Korean War, several families received calls from military officials asking if they had heard from their missing relatives. In 1973, when American POWs were returned from Vietnam, the same cycle repeated. Each time, the 5 families would experience a surge of desperate hope, followed by crushing disappointment when their loved ones were not among the returned servicemen. By the 1980s, most of the parents and spouses had died, taking with them the most intense grief, but also the strongest motivation to seek answers. The children who had grown up without fathers, like Michael Henderson Jr. and Susan Chen, became the keepers of their families' memories. They would occasionally correspond with each other, sharing information and theories about what might have happened to their fathers. Michael Jr., who became a successful engineer in Omaha, never stopped believing that his father's disappearance could be solved with sufficient investigation. He hired private researchers, consulted with military historians, and even traveled to Okinawa twice in the 1990s to walk the battlefields where his father had vanished. Each trip brought more questions than answers, as the tropical landscape had reclaimed most evidence of the wartime fighting. Susan Chen, now doctor. Susan Chen and a professor of military history at UC Berkeley approached the mystery from an academic perspective. Her doctoral dissertation examined the psychological and social impact on families of servicemen classified as missing in action. Through her research, she discovered that over 8,000 American servicemen had been classified as MIA during the Pacific War, and fewer than 10% of those cases had ever been resolved with physical evidence. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching us from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested to know to which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The bureaucratic indifference that the families encountered became a source of additional trauma. Military records were sealed, classified, or simply lost in the massive bureaucratic reorganization that followed World War II. Freedom of Information Act requests, when they became available in the 1970s, often returned heavily redacted documents that raised more questions than they answered. The families learned to navigate a maze of government agencies, each claiming that another department held the crucial information. As the official investigation stalled and years passed without resolution, various theories emerged to explain the disappearance of Nebraska's Revenge and her crew. These hypotheses ranged from the plausible to the fantastical, each reflecting the desperate need for answers in the absence of concrete evidence. Military historians, amateur researchers, and the families themselves would spend decades analyzing every possible scenario, trying to solve a puzzle with too many missing pieces. The most straightforward theory suggested that Henderson's tank had fallen into one of Okinawa's numerous natural cave systems during the chaos of the Banzai charge. The island's geological structure, formed by coral reefs and volcanic activity over millions of years, created an extensive network of underground chambers and tunnels. Many of these caverns were hidden beneath thin layers of soil and vegetation, creating natural traps for unwary vehicles. Proponents of this theory pointed to similar incidents during the battle, where tanks had disappeared into concealed pits, though in those cases, wreckage had eventually been recovered. However, the cave theory faced significant challenges. Post-battle surveys conducted by Army engineers had mapped most of the significant cave systems in the Kunigami sector, and none appeared large enough to completely conceal a 30-ton Sherman tank. Additionally, the geological surveys conducted in the 1950s during the American occupation of Okinawa had used ground-penetrating technology to locate potential cave systems for security reasons, but found no evidence of a large metallic object in the suspected area of the tank's disappearance. A more disturbing theory emerged from testimonies of Japanese prisoners captured after the war. Several former Imperial Army soldiers claimed that their unit had successfully ambushed an American flamethrower tank, using a coordinated attack involving shaped charges and suicide bombers. According to these accounts, the tank had been completely destroyed in a massive explosion that left no recognizable remains. The Japanese soldiers claimed they had then pushed the scattered debris into a coastal ravine to prevent the Americans from recovering the wreckage for intelligence purposes. This theory gained credibility when researchers discovered that the Japanese had developed specific tactics for dealing with American flamethrower tanks, recognizing them as both tactically and psychologically devastating weapons. Captured Japanese documents revealed detailed instructions for anti-tank teams, including the use of concealed demolition charges designed to completely destroy armored vehicles. However, the lack of any crater or blast pattern in the suspected area raised questions about the accuracy of these testimonies. Perhaps the most troubling theory involved the possibility of betrayal from within Allied forces. This hypothesis emerged from inconsistencies in the official timeline and conflicting witness testimonies about radio communications on the morning of the disappearance. Some researchers suggested that Henderson's crew might have been deliberately led into an ambush by someone with access to their mission parameters and radio frequencies. The betrayal theory was supported by evidence of known security breaches within the 713th Tank Battalion during the Okinawa campaign. In March 1945, 2 American soldiers had been court-martialed for providing Japanese forces with intelligence about Allied troop movements. The possibility that other security compromises had gone undetected seemed plausible given the chaotic nature of the battlefield and the strain that prolonged combat placed on military discipline. Dr. Susan Chen's academic research uncovered additional circumstantial evidence supporting the betrayal hypothesis. Her analysis of casualty reports from the 713th Tank Battalion revealed unusual patterns in tank losses during the final weeks of the Okinawa campaign. Several experienced crews had been lost in circumstances that suggested their positions and movements had been predicted by enemy forces. However, this evidence remained inconclusive, as Japanese tactical improvements and increasing desperation could also explain the pattern of Allied losses. A fourth theory proposed that the crew had deserted, abandoning their tank and attempting to escape the battlefield. This hypothesis was considered heretical by military authorities and family members alike, but gained some support from documented cases of combat exhaustion and desertion during the later stages of the Pacific War. The theory suggested that Henderson and his men, traumatized by months of flamethrower warfare, had hidden their tank and attempted to disappear until the war ended. The desertion theory was supported by psychological profiles that military psychiatrists had begun developing during World War II. Flamethrower operators showed higher rates of combat stress reactions than other tank crew members, often suffering from nightmares, depression, and moral injuries related to their weapons' devastating effects. Some researchers argued that Henderson's crew, having survived longer than most flamethrower teams, might have reached a psychological breaking point. However, the desertion theory faced significant obstacles. None of the crew members had shown signs of combat fatigue in their final letters home, and their military records contained no disciplinary actions or psychological evaluations. Additionally, the logistics of hiding a 30-ton tank and then maintaining 5 deserters on a small island under military occupation seemed nearly impossible. The most exotic theory involved the possibility that Japanese forces had captured the tank intact, along with its crew. This scenario suggested that the Banzai charge had been a feint designed to isolate and surround Henderson's position, allowing Japanese troops to overwhelm the tank without destroying it. Proponents of this theory argued that the Japanese military would have placed enormous value on capturing an intact flamethrower tank for intelligence and propaganda purposes. Evidence for the capture theory came from scattered reports of American prisoners being held in underground facilities throughout Okinawa. Some of these accounts described prisoners being forced to operate captured American equipment, including tanks and artillery pieces. However, no credible witness had ever reported seeing Henderson's crew among Japanese prisoners, and no documentation of such a capture had been found in captured Japanese military archives. Michael Henderson Jr. became obsessed with the capture theory during the 1990s, believing it offered the only scenario in which his father might have survived the initial disappearance. He spent considerable personal resources investigating rumors of secret Japanese prison camps and interviewing elderly Japanese veterans who might have witnessed such an operation. His research revealed the existence of previously unknown prisoner facilities, but found no evidence connecting them to his father's crew. The multiplicity of theories reflected not only the absence of concrete evidence, but also the different psychological needs of those seeking answers. Family members tended to favor theories that suggested their loved ones might have survived, at least initially. Military researchers preferred explanations that preserved the honor and reputation of American forces. Academic historians looked for theories that fit broader patterns of wartime behavior and decision-making. By the turn of the century, most serious researchers had concluded that the mystery would never be solved. The physical evidence had been lost to time and nature, key witnesses had died, and military records from the chaotic final weeks of the Okinawa campaign remained incomplete or contradictory. The case of Nebraska's revenge seemed destined to join the thousands of other unresolved mysteries from World War II. The psychological impact of having a missing loved one, rather than a confirmed death, created a unique form of trauma that military psychiatrists would later term ambiguous loss. Unlike families who received bodies to bury and could progress through traditional stages of grief, the families of Henderson's crew remained trapped in a state of suspended mourning that could last decades. This emotional limbo profoundly shaped the lives of children, spouses, and parents who struggled to move forward while maintaining hope for resolution. Mary Henderson's experience epitomized this struggle. After remarrying in 1952 to Robert Daniels, a local insurance agent, she attempted to create a normal family life for Michael Jr. and her new daughter, Susan. However, the ghost of her first marriage haunted every milestone. Michael Jr., his graduation, his first job, his own wedding, all were shadowed by the absence of the father who should have been there. Mary kept her maiden name for official documents related to her son, maintaining a legal and emotional connection to her missing husband that complicated her second marriage. The challenge of explaining his father's disappearance to young Michael Jr. became a constant source of anxiety for Mary. How do you tell a child that his father might be dead, might be alive, might return someday, or might never be found? She chose to present his father as a hero who had gone away during the war and might come back, a narrative that gave the boy hope, but also prevented him from processing the loss. This approach created unrealistic expectations that would plague Michael Jr. throughout his childhood and adolescence. Michael Jr., his personality was profoundly shaped by his father's absence and uncertain fate. He became obsessively organized and responsible, as if preparing for the day when his father would return and judge his behavior. His academic achievements and later professional success were driven partly by a desire to make his missing father proud. He chose engineering as a career path because his mother had told him that his father was good with machines, creating an imagined connection across the decades. The Kowalski household in Detroit became a shrine to memory and hope. Anna Kowalski's daily rituals extended far beyond lighting candles and prayer. She maintained Danny's bedroom exactly as he had left it, changing the sheets weekly and dusting his belongings as if he might return at any moment. His clothes remained in the closet, his high school trophies on the shelf, his letters home carefully preserved in a wooden box. This preservation of space became both a comfort and a prison for the family. Danny's younger brother, Stan, struggled with living in the shadow of a missing sibling who had achieved mythical status in the family's memory. Every accomplishment was measured against Danny's heroic service. Every failure seemed magnified by comparison to his brother's sacrifice. Stan eventually moved to California after high school, seeking to escape the suffocating atmosphere of perpetual mourning that had consumed his childhood home. The Rodriguez family's approach reflected their cultural and religious background, but also created unique challenges. The lack of a proper funeral conflicted with deeply held beliefs about honoring the dead and ensuring the soul's peaceful transition to the afterlife. Rosa Rodriguez consulted with several priests about the appropriate way to mourn a son whose fate remained unknown. The religious guidance she received was contradictory. Some clergy suggested treating Jimmy as martyred, while others counseled patience and continued prayer for his return. Miguel Rodriguez channeled his grief into work, taking on extra shifts at the construction site where he was employed. His silence about Jimmy became so complete that younger family members sometimes didn't know they had had an older brother until they discovered photographs and documents as teenagers. This enforced secrecy created confusion and resentment among Jimmy's siblings, who felt cheated of the right to mourn their brother openly. The Chen family faced the additional burden of racial prejudice that complicated their grief. Eddie's parents, who had limited English skills, struggled to navigate the military bureaucracy while dealing with community suspicions about their son's loyalty. The family's Chinese cultural traditions included elaborate funeral rites and ancestor veneration that were impossible to perform without a body or certainty of death. Eddie's younger sister Susan became the family's advocate and interpreter, translating not only language but also cultural concepts between her parents and American officials. This responsibility forced her to mature quickly and shaped her future career choice in military history. Her academic success became a way to honor her missing brother, while proving the family's American loyalty to skeptical neighbors. Susan Chen's research into her brother's disappearance led her to discover that many Asian American families had faced similar challenges in dealing with military casualties. The combination of bureaucratic indifference and social prejudice created additional barriers to information and support. Her eventual academic career was motivated partly by a desire to document these overlooked aspects of the wartime experience. The O'Brien family's Irish Catholic background provided strong community support, but also created expectations about how grief should be expressed and resolved. Tommy's mother, Bridget, was expected to be the strong matriarch holding the family together, but his disappearance broke something fundamental in her spirit. Her depression was seen by some community members as a failure of faith, adding guilt to her already overwhelming grief. Tommy's father, Patrick's descent into alcoholism was unfortunately common among working-class families dealing with war losses, but the uncertainty about his son's fate made recovery more difficult. He couldn't engage in the traditional Irish wake rituals that might have provided closure, nor could he fully embrace hope for his son's return. This emotional paralysis contributed to his early death and the family's subsequent financial struggles. The extended O'Brien family fragmented under the stress of unresolved loss. Some relatives believed Tommy was dead and should be mourned as such, while others maintained hope for his return. These disagreements led to arguments during family gatherings and eventually to estrangement between different branches of the family. Tommy's disappearance had created a wound that spread through the entire clan. As the decades passed, the children who had grown up with missing fathers began having families of their own, forcing them to confront how their own parenting would be shaped by loss. Michael Henderson Jr. became overprotective of his own children, constantly worried about their safety and reluctant to let them take normal childhood risks. His marriage suffered from his inability to fully commit emotionally, always holding part of himself in reserve as his mother had done. Susan Chen chose not to have children, partly because she feared passing on the trauma and uncertainty that had defined her own childhood. Her academic career became her primary focus, and her research into missing servicemen became both professional calling and personal therapy. Through her work, she connected with other families dealing with similar losses, creating informal support networks that hadn't existed for their parents' generation. The grandchildren of the missing crew members grew up with family histories that contained mysterious gaps and unspoken sorrows. They learned not to ask too many questions about their grandfathers, sensing the pain that such inquiries caused. Some became fascinated by family history and military genealogy, while others deliberately avoided learning about their wartime heritage to escape the burden of unresolved grief. The burden of remembrance fell disproportionately on the women in these families, who became the keepers of memory and hope across generations. Their stories illuminate how personal trauma intersects with broader social expectations about military service, family loyalty, and the meaning of sacrifice. These women navigated decades of uncertainty while raising children, maintaining households, and often fighting bureaucratic systems that seemed indifferent to their pain. Mary Henderson Daniels embodied the complexity of this role. Her second marriage to Robert Daniels was successful in many practical ways. He provided financial stability, was kind to Michael Jr., and gave her the daughter she had always wanted. However, she never fully integrated emotionally into this new life. She maintained separate bank accounts for money related to her first marriage, kept Henderson family photographs in a private area of the house, and observed the anniversary of Michael Sr.'s disappearance with private rituals that excluded her second family. Robert Daniels, by all accounts a decent man, found himself competing with a ghost. Michael Sr.'s heroic status could never be challenged or diminished by ordinary human flaws because he existed only in idealized memory. Robert's practical contributions to the family, steady income, reliable presence, help with homework and household repairs, seemed mundane compared to the romanticized image of the missing war hero. This dynamic created tension that both spouses acknowledged but could never fully resolve. Michael Jr.'s relationship with his stepfather was cordial but never intimate. He appreciated Robert's efforts but could never fully accept him as a father figure. The boy's conception of masculinity and fatherhood was based on his mother's stories about Michael Sr., stories that emphasized courage, sacrifice, and devotion to duty. These idealized standards created unrealistic expectations that affected Michael Jr.'s relationships with male authority figures throughout his life. Anna Kowalski's dedication to preserving Danny's memory became legendary in her Detroit neighborhood. She organized annual memorial services at St. Stanislaus Church, where she would read Danny's letters aloud and display his photographs. These gatherings attracted other military families dealing with similar losses, creating an informal support network centered on shared grief and hope. However, Anna's devotion came at a personal cost. She never remarried, claiming that her heart remained with her missing son and that she needed to be available when he returned. Her other children learned to accept that Danny's needs, even imaginary ones, took precedence over their own. The family's resources, both emotional and financial, were disproportionately allocated to maintaining Danny's shrine and searching for information about his fate. Stan Kowalski's decision to move to California represented not just geographic distance, but emotional escape from a household that had become a museum. His letters home were dutiful but distant, and his visits became increasingly infrequent as he established his own life on the West Coast. The family interpreted his departure as betrayal, but Stan saw it as necessary self-preservation. He eventually became successful in the aerospace industry, but never spoke about his missing brother to colleagues or even to his own children. Rosa Rodriguez's approach to grief was deeply influenced by Mexican Catholic traditions that emphasized the continuing presence of the dead in daily life. She created an altar in her home dedicated to Jimmy, complete with photographs, candles, flowers, and personal mementos. This shrine became a focal point for family prayers and celebrations, keeping Jimmy's memory alive in daily rituals. Unlike Anna Kowalski's frozen-in-time approach, Rosa's altar evolved over the years. She added new photographs of the grandchildren Jimmy would never meet, included prayers for other missing servicemen, and eventually incorporated elements honoring other deceased family members. This evolution reflected a more integrated approach to grief that acknowledged loss while allowing for growth and change. Miguel Rodriguez's silence about his son created a different kind of memorial, absence as presence. His refusal to speak Jimmy's name aloud became a family legend, though different relatives interpreted this silence differently. Some saw it as profound respect and continuing love, while others viewed it as an inability to process grief in a healthy way. This ambiguity allowed family members to project their own understanding of loss onto Miguel's behavior. If this case has already captured your attention, leave a like. It helps the story of Sergeant Henderson and his crew reach more people. Li Mei Chen's approach to her son's disappearance was complicated by cultural differences and language barriers. Traditional Chinese customs included elaborate ancestor veneration rituals that required specific knowledge about the circumstances of death. Without this information, she struggled to perform appropriate ceremonies for Eddie's spirit. Her husband, Chen Wei-ming, consulted with other members of San Francisco's Chinese community about proper procedures, but received conflicting advice about how to honor a missing son. The Chen family's grief was also shaped by their experience as immigrants dealing with discrimination. Eddie's military service had been a source of pride and validation of their American identity, but his disappearance raised questions in some community members' minds about the wisdom of such complete assimilation. Some older Chinese residents suggested that the family's misfortune was punishment for abandoning traditional ways, while others saw it as evidence that American society would never fully accept Chinese immigrants regardless of their sacrifices. Susan Chen's role as cultural interpreter and family advocate began early and shaped her entire life trajectory. As a teenager, she was translating complex military correspondence for her parents, explaining bureaucratic procedures, and representing the family in interactions with government officials. This responsibility forced her to develop sophisticated communication skills and deep knowledge about military culture that would later inform her academic career. Bridget O'Brien's depression following Tommy's disappearance was severe enough to require hospitalization on several occasions, though mental health treatment in the 1940s and 1950s was primitive compared to modern standards. The family's shame about her condition, combined with the uncertainty about Tommy's fate, created a double burden of secrecy. Neighbors knew something was wrong, but weren't given enough information to provide meaningful support. Patrick O'Brien's alcoholism was more visible and socially acceptable in their working-class Irish community than his wife's mental illness. His drinking was understood as a normal masculine response to loss, even as it destroyed his health and the family's finances. His death in 1952 created additional trauma for a family already struggling with unresolved grief, leaving Bridget to raise the remaining children alone while dealing with her own psychological issues. The O'Brien family's experience illustrates how missing servicemen created cascading effects that damaged multiple generations. Tommy's surviving siblings grew up with limited parental attention and resources, affecting their education, career prospects, and emotional development. Some became overachievers, trying to compensate for their parents' neglect, while others struggled with depression and substance abuse that echoed their father's self-destructive patterns. The women who married into these families, the daughters-in-law who never met their famous husbands' missing fathers or brothers, faced unique challenges in understanding family dynamics shaped by unresolved loss. Some were drawn to men who carried this trauma, perhaps hoping to heal wounds that predated their relationships. Others found themselves competing with idealized memories they could never challenge or understand. The grandchildren of the missing crew members inherited both the burden of memory and the expectation to carry forward family honor. Some embraced this responsibility, becoming involved in military history, veterans' affairs, or genealogical research. Others rejected it, seeing the focus on past trauma as an obstacle to building healthy family relationships in the present. These different approaches sometimes created conflict between siblings and cousins who had grown up in the same families but developed opposite responses to inherited grief. By the 1990s, the children of Henderson's crew had become middle-aged adults with their own families, careers, and perspectives on their father's disappearance. The Cold War had ended, the World War II generation was dying off, and American society was beginning to reckon with the psychological costs of military service in new ways. This changing context created opportunities for renewed investigation into decades-old mysteries, but also highlighted how much physical evidence had been lost to time and development. Michael Henderson Jr. had built a successful engineering career in Omaha, specializing in hydraulic systems for agricultural equipment. His technical skills and methodical approach to problem-solving served him well professionally, but he couldn't resist applying the same analytical methods to his father's disappearance. His home office became filled with maps, military documents, weather reports, and correspondence with military historians. His wife, Patricia, sometimes joked that she felt like she was married to two men, her husband and his missing father. Michael Jr. As obsession intensified in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed and previously classified documents began appearing in archives around the world, he hoped that Japanese or Soviet records might contain information about American prisoners or missing servicemen that had been hidden during the Cold War. He hired a translator to review Japanese military documents that became available through academic exchanges, and even learned to use early internet bulletin boards to connect with other families searching for missing relatives. His first trip to Okinawa in 1993 was both pilgrimage and investigation. Walking the battlefields where his father had vanished, Michael Jr. tried to visualize the terrain as it had appeared in 1945, before decades of development had transformed the island. He interviewed elderly Okinawan residents who remembered the battle, visited the caves that had been mapped by military surveyors, and studied geological reports that might explain where a tank could have vanished without a trace. The trip provided emotional closure but few concrete answers. Okinawa in the 1990s bore little resemblance to the war-torn landscape of 1945. Tourist developments, military expansions, and natural growth had obscured most physical evidence of the fighting. The cave systems that might have swallowed a tank had been filled with concrete for safety reasons or had collapsed naturally over the intervening decades. Susan Chen had pursued an academic career that allowed her to investigate her brother's disappearance with scholarly rigor. Her position at UC Berkeley provided access to military archives, professional conferences where she met other researchers, and graduate students who assisted with translation and document analysis. Her approach was more systematic than Michael Jr.'s personal quest, but equally driven by the need to understand what had happened to her family. Dr. Chen's research revealed patterns of bureaucratic negligence and institutional racism that extended far beyond her brother's case. Military records from World War II showed consistent disparities in how missing servicemen cases were investigated and resolved, with minority soldiers receiving less attention and fewer resources. Her academic papers on this topic earned recognition in military history circles and helped establish new standards for investigating historical casualties. However, her professional success came with personal costs. The emotional labor of researching military trauma while carrying her own family's unresolved grief created stress that affected her health and relationships. She never married or had children, dedicating her life to work that was both professional calling and personal therapy. Colleagues respected her scholarship, but worried about the psychological price of her single-minded focus on loss and memory. Stan Kowalski had deliberately chosen a different path, building a life in California that had no obvious connections to his family's trauma. He worked for aerospace contractors, designing components for military aircraft, but rarely discussed his brother's military service or his family's long vigil. His children knew they had an uncle who had died in World War II, but Stan provided few details about the circumstances or ongoing mystery. Stan's approach represented a form of generational healing through deliberate forgetting. He believed that his parents' obsession with Danny's disappearance had consumed his childhood and prevented healthy family relationships. His own parenting style emphasized present-moment connection with his children rather than dwelling on family history or honoring absent relatives. This choice created tension during visits to Detroit, where his apparent indifference to his mother's memorial rituals seemed disrespectful. The Rodriguez family had experienced more successful integration of loss into ongoing family life. Jimmy's younger siblings had grown up with their brother's memory as a positive presence rather than a haunting absence. Family gatherings included stories about Jimmy that celebrated his personality and accomplishments rather than focusing solely on the tragic circumstances of his disappearance. Maria Rodriguez Santos, Jimmy's youngest sister, became the family historian and keeper of documents. She organized family photographs, preserved letters, and maintained correspondence with military archives. Her approach was less obsessive than Anna Kowalski's shrine-keeping, but more active than Stan Kowalski's forgetting. She wanted her children to know their uncle as a real person, rather than either an idealized hero or a source of unresolved grief. The third generation, the grandchildren of the missing crew members, had diverse relationships with their family's military legacy. Some became interested in military history or chose military careers themselves, feeling called to honor their grandfather's service. Others showed little interest in the past, preferring to focus on contemporary concerns and opportunities. Tommy O'Brien Jr., named after the uncle he never met, enlisted in the Marine Corps during the Persian Gulf War. His decision was partly motivated by a desire to understand what his uncle had experienced and to connect with a family heritage that had been damaged by his grandfather's alcoholism and his grandmother's mental illness. Military service gave him a framework for understanding sacrifice and loss that helped him process his family's unresolved trauma. Other grandchildren found the weight of family history burdensome rather than inspiring. They grew up feeling pressure to achieve success that would honor their missing grandfathers, or to pursue careers that would somehow justify the sacrifices made by previous generations. Some rebelled against these expectations by deliberately choosing paths that had nothing to do with military service or traditional concepts of heroism. The 1990s brought new technologies that offered hope for resolving cold cases from World War II. DNA analysis became sophisticated enough to identify remains from limited biological samples, and computer databases made it possible to cross-reference information from multiple sources. Ground-penetrating radar and underwater detection equipment offered possibilities for locating wreckage that had been missed by earlier search efforts. However, these technological advances also highlighted the limitations of investigating decades-old mysteries. Much of the potentially useful evidence had been destroyed by natural processes, development, or simple neglect. Military records were scattered across multiple archives, often with poor indexing or missing crucial details. The witnesses who might have provided key information had died, and their memories had died with them. The Internet created new possibilities for collaboration between researchers and families dealing with similar cases. Michael Henderson, Jr. discovered online forums where children of missing servicemen shared information and emotional support. These virtual communities provided validation for feelings of loss and uncertainty that had been carried in isolation for decades. Dr. Susan Chen began using digital archives and international academic networks to access documents that had been previously unavailable to American researchers. Her correspondence with historians in Japan, Russia, and Eastern Europe sometimes revealed new information about prisoner transfers, casualty reports, or military operations that might be relevant to understanding what had happened to American servicemen who had vanished during World War II. Despite these technological and social advances, the core mystery remained unsolved. The 5 men of Nebraska's Revenge had vanished as completely in the 1990s as they had in 1945. Their families had found ways to live with uncertainty, but closure remained elusive. The case seemed destined to remain forever open, another tragic footnote to humanity's most devastating war. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source in March 2025 when professional deep-sea diving instructor Kenji Nakamura was exploring underwater cave systems off the southeastern coast of Okinawa. Nakamura, a third-generation Okinawan whose grandfather had witnessed the 1945 battle, specialized in technical diving for both recreational clients and marine archaeology projects. His exploration of the Tsunabe reef system was initially motivated by reports from local fishermen about unusual sonar readings in deep-water channels that had never been properly surveyed. The cave system that Nakamura entered that morning was known to local divers, but had never been fully explored due to its depth and the technical skills required to navigate its narrow passages safely. At approximately 60 meters below sea level, the limestone caverns extended horizontally for nearly 200 meters before opening into a large chamber that had been completely sealed from surface access. The chamber showed evidence of violent geological activity, with collapsed ceiling sections and debris fields that suggested seismic disturbance sometime in the distant past. It was in this sealed chamber that Nakamura's underwater lights illuminated the unmistakable silhouette of a World War II-era Sherman tank. The vehicle sat upright on the cavern floor, its turret intact, but twisted at an unnatural angle from the hull. The tank's identification numbers were still visible on the rear deck, though decades of saltwater corrosion had eaten away much of the external armor plating. Most remarkably, the tank appeared to have been burned from the inside out, with the hatches blown open and internal components fused by intense heat. Nakamura's training in underwater archaeology prevented him from disturbing the site, but his photographs and video documentation provided the first concrete evidence of what had happened to Nebraska's Revenge and her crew. The tank's position and the geological evidence in the chamber suggested that it had fallen through a concealed opening in the cave roof sometime during or shortly after the 1945 battle, and that subsequent seismic activity had sealed the chamber from above. The discovery triggered a complex international response involving the U.S. military, Japanese authorities, and Okinawan government officials. The cave system lay within Japanese territorial waters, but contained the remains of American servicemen, creating jurisdictional questions that required diplomatic resolution. The technical challenges of recovering evidence from a depth of 60 meters in unstable underwater caves added another layer of complexity to the investigation. Initial underwater surveys confirmed that the tank contained human remains, though the saltwater environment and the evidence of fire damage had severely compromised the biological evidence. Military forensic specialists estimated that a complete recovery operation would require months of preparation and specialized equipment designed for underwater archaeological work in hazardous conditions. The news of the discovery reached the surviving family members through military notification channels that had been established for precisely such situations. Michael Henderson, Jr., now 79 years old, received a phone call from a military casualty officer who explained that his father's tank had been located and that preliminary evidence suggested the entire crew had perished in the initial incident. The mixture of relief and renewed grief that accompanied this news was overwhelming for families who had spent 8 decades living with uncertainty. Dr. Susan Chen, now retired from UC Berkeley but still active in military historical research, was contacted by Defense POWMIA accounting agency officials who sought her expertise in analyzing the discovery. Her decades of research into her brother's disappearance had made her one of the leading civilian experts on missing in action cases from the Pacific War, and her academic connections provided valuable resources for understanding the historical context of the find. The underwater archaeology team that was assembled to investigate the site included specialists from multiple institutions and countries. Dr. James Morrison from the University of Hawaii led the American team, while Professor Hiroshi Tanaka from Tokyo Maritime University contributed expertise in wartime wreck analysis. The technical diving operations were coordinated by the same company that had employed Kenji Nakamura, ensuring that the recovery work would benefit from intimate knowledge of the local cave systems. The first detailed survey of the wreck site revealed evidence that supported several of the theories that had been proposed over the decades, while definitively disproving others. The tank's position and the damage patterns suggested that it had indeed fallen into a concealed cave system, but not as a result of simple mechanical failure or enemy action. Instead, the evidence pointed to a massive explosion that had blown the vehicle through the cave roof and into the chamber below. Analysis of the tank's internal damage revealed that the explosion had originated from within the vehicle, specifically from the area where the flamethrower fuel tanks were located. This discovery suggested that the crew had been killed instantly when their own weapon systems exploded, either due to mechanical failure or enemy fire that had penetrated the fuel storage area. The intensity of the internal fire explained why no recognizable remains had been found during the original search efforts in 1945. The geological evidence in the cave chamber indicated that the opening through which the tank had fallen had been sealed by seismic activity within weeks or months of the initial incident. Okinawa's location along active tectonic plate boundaries created frequent earthquakes throughout the region, and several significant seismic events had been recorded in the months following the end of World War II. This explained why subsequent searches had failed to locate any trace of the missing tank. However, the discovery also raised new questions about the circumstances leading to the explosion. The tank's final position suggested that it had been moving at considerable speed when the blast occurred, which was inconsistent with the defensive posture that would have been expected during a Banzai charge. Additionally, radio communications logs that were recovered from military archives showed that Henderson's final transmission had reported enemy movement but had not indicated any immediate threat to his position. The forensic analysis of the wreck site was complicated by the saltwater environment and the passage of 8 decades, but several significant pieces of evidence were recovered. Personal effects belonging to the crew members were found scattered throughout the tank's interior, including identification tags, a wallet containing family photographs, and fragments of letters from home. These items provided confirmation of the crew's identities, while offering poignant reminders of the human cost of the tragedy. Most significantly, investigators discovered a partially preserved notebook that had belonged to Sergeant Henderson. The saltwater had destroyed most of the pages, but chemical analysis revealed traces of ink that could be processed using advanced spectroscopic techniques. The recovered text fragments included references to unusual patrol routes and questions about intelligence, suggesting that Henderson might have had concerns about the mission parameters that led to his crew's disappearance. The notebook evidence supported the theory that Henderson's crew might have been deliberately led into a trap, though it didn't provide definitive proof of betrayal. The references to intelligence concerns could have reflected normal wartime paranoia, or they might have indicated genuine security breaches within the 713th Tank Battalion. Military historians noted that such concerns would have been common during the final weeks of the Okinawa campaign, when battle fatigue and stress were affecting decision-making at all levels of command.